Hello everyone, today I'm talking to Jari Eloranta, who is a professor of economic history and vice dean, faculty of social sciences at the University of Helsinki. Hi Jari.
Hi.
So Jari, just a quick question. So what's your view on the latest conflict developments in Ukraine? How do you see situation going?
Well, I think a lot of the media attention is kind of being sucked up by the United States and Trump at the moment. So it's kind of unfortunate, but so the media attention is not quite there. But the situation is not that different since the last months. I think the Russians are continuing their slow, kind of very costly assault here in different fronts, and the Ukrainians are, they're doing their best to halt some of those advances, and of course, especially in relations, if we truly get to the negotiating table sometime, hopefully this year, and in which then we'll have to see what kind of steps that takes. But in terms of the military situation, it hasn't changed all that much. I think also the economic side of it hasn't changed all that much, even with Trump now being in power, and that there's some readiness on the U.S. side to continue supporting Ukraine, especially if it comes more in the form of loans or frozen Russian assets. And of course, Europeans are very keen on continuing this. They just have to continue the sanctions against Russia. So that hasn't really changed all that much.
But do you think that Russia would be interested in negotiating? It seems like they have upper hand in a battlefield. Do you think that there's a possibility?
I think there's a definite possibility, and there's several components to it. The Russian economy has a lot of problems in terms of the regional problems, in terms of the interest rates, in terms of the banking crisis that they're experiencing. Also, if there's any, I think particularly the price of oil, if there's a big decline in the price of oil, that would immediately have a negative impact on Russian ability. Yes, in terms of the actual conditions on the ground, yet they're gaining ground very slowly, but none of the advances that they made have had really substantial strategic significance. So I think a lot of this is very costly for Russia. So I think they are ready to negotiate under certain terms, and with whoever the countries and people involved would be, those are some of the sticking points. But of course, Russia will, I would imagine, and already has shown that they want to do some sort of deal or try to negotiate some sort of deal with the Trump administration. So I think that's their primary goal. If that doesn't really get them very far, I think they'll be open to more, multilateral discussions.
Okay, I see, because I'm asking this because according to different sources and estimates, they can drag this for another year or two. And so perhaps they might be interested at capturing as much as possible, right?
Right. Yeah, it's possible, but on the other hand, they haven't been able to have major breakthroughs. They're very costly, and the more body bags come back to Russia, the more the potential for some sort of civic uprising there is. And I think the Russian economy is, based on some certain experts and reports, the Russian economy is in quite bad of a shape. It's very overheated, and it has a lot of logistical problems, and Ukrainians have been quite adept at disrupting some of those infrastructures related to that. So I think Russian economy is much more vulnerable than most media would let us to believe. And in fact, that's a huge risk for Putin and his regime, that, if they don't change course soon, and especially get rid of, some sort of deal on the sanctions, that's going to be I would say a big risk for him in terms of sort of generating societal unrest. I think in Russia we've seen already, if there's been some disruptions of some sewer systems or electricity, some stuff that Ukrainians have withstood with quite great dignity. They have caused immediate sort of backlash and not kind of an uprising, but some sort of movement among the people. So I think there are quite a few sort of vulnerabilities in the Russian society today.
Thanks for giving this overview. And so basically, it will be a time for painful compromises from both sides, because both sides actually, this is the war of exhaustion, right? So
yeah.
neither side is winning. So
yeah, I would say, yeah, both sides would have to compromise, and I think most analysts would predict some elements of that compromise. I mean, Russia is probably not going to let go of the Crimean Peninsula. It's not going to let go of some of the territories they conquered in eastern Ukraine, and the future of those areas, unfortunately, will be very dire. I mean, Russia will not have any money to really invest there. Despite their propaganda, they won't have money to invest there. It'll be probably very, very grim future for those areas. They'll be sort of like in between spaces for logistic support for Crimean Peninsula. So and that's, of course, is a very tough compromise for Ukrainians to accept. But on the other hand, Russians will have to accept that some of the stuff that they've been asking for in terms of security guarantees on the Ukrainian side, or any sort of being able to dictate political outcomes in Ukraine, that's a non-starter. That's not going to happen. So for them to be able to sell their compromise as some sort of win for Putin, that's the issue. And I guess once we get closer to actual negotiations and we understand what the process might be, Russian sort of the kind of propaganda machine they typically try to sort of float different ideas because they control so much of it, different ideas through their sort of mouthpieces that, okay, let's see how people respond to certain ideas. So ultimately, how can they sell this upcoming necessary compromise to their people as something that was worth it? And of course, they've laid some of the groundwork already during the war in terms of, pretending as if those were their goals to begin with. So, but they'll try to make this into something that, I mean, ultimately, I've always said that this is not something that Putin could do, but for him, the best option would be that Ukraine joins NATO. In fact, being a member country in NATO, that would constrain Ukrainians in the future too, in terms of not taking back territories from Russia. So, but of course, for Putin, that would not be a compromise that he probably could live with.
So, do you think that from Ukrainian side he would demand to drop this NATO aspirations then?
It's possible, and I think Ukraine might be able to live with that if they get serious enough security guarantees from the US and EU. If there's significant troop presence and support, and of course, I think money is going to be a big part of this. The Western countries are probably going to offer substantial sort of rebuilding and reconstruction money. This is something, of course, there's different estimates of how much that would take, ranging from upwards of $1 trillion US dollars. So that will have to be a multilateral effort to rebuild and do certain things in Ukraine. Of course, some of that has been going on throughout the war as well. But if the package is good enough in terms of rebuilding Ukraine, getting adequate security guarantees and technological support and so forth, that guarantees the sovereignty of Ukraine, however the borders will be, I think that's a package that they can accept.
And in terms of actually securing this, ensuring the ceasefire, do you think that there is a possibility that Russia will agree, let's say, on deploying EU-based troops or under United Nations framework?
Yeah, I would say probably yes. They would insist on at least part of it. And usually ceasefire is just the first step in a very complicated process. So they would probably accept something in the first phase, something like this, a UN presence, and of course it would have to be robust enough that it actually has a deterrent, especially in terms of any sort of potential Russian aggression. So it would have to be something like that has enough teeth to be able to do that. But I think in the long run, there would have to be much more specific US, EU military assistance and troop presence in Ukraine that would guarantee any sort of more lasting peace, I would say.
But if with the US declined role, you think that EU can step in actually and ensure greater support in the post-war period, especially?
It could. I think US would be. My prediction is, given what we know about the Trump administration, I think they would be open to security guarantees that are not primarily supported by US. They would have some sort of military presence in Ukraine no matter what, but probably a little bit more scaled down presence, and then EU countries and NATO countries in general would provide the bulk of the military presence that would secure Ukraine for the near future. So it would be, of course, on the US side, they would also guarantee certain technological support, et cetera, that would guarantee the kind of the lethality of Ukrainian military deterrence. So I think it's possible that Trump can sell to his supporters the idea that US is kind of not quite so obviously involved, but they provide a whole bunch of stuff, and EU and NATO, they take more of a kind of a troop-heavy role in this secured peace.
Perhaps United Kingdom can also support.
I think so. UK has been quite adamant and pro guaranteeing Ukrainian security. So I would imagine they would have a robust presence too. But of course, in a more ideal world, again, I don't know if that will happen, but if we finally would get some sort of more clarity from the Chinese side, if they would be willing to provide some peacekeeping operations, etc. I mean, that would probably be a welcome addition to this, but I somewhat doubt that they would wade into this. They may provide some diplomatic presence and so forth, but so far I think the signals coming from them have not been very firm that they would take any sort of position that would be against the broader Russian interests.
And once you think this peace deal is reached, Ukraine can pursue some type of Marshall Plan for rebuilding Ukraine. Maybe EU can extend this Ukraine facility framework and allocate more funds. You think it will be possible?
Yeah, I think it will be possible. There's been some of those plans floated already, and I know some colleagues who've been involved in devising that plan, very much along the lines of a Marshall Plan. And some of the estimates there, indeed, they were like several hundreds of millions or more than 1 trillion to do that. And there are phases to that plan, some of which are already kind of going on in terms of some regional rebuilding efforts and so forth, how they do it. It also involved a great deal of sort of oversight and Western, I guess, presence in terms of just reducing corruption and perhaps paving the way also in the very, not near future, but at some point to EU membership for Ukraine. And that's been part of those plans as well. But of course, like the Marshall Plan after the Second World War, this would all involve not just money, it would involve a lot of technology, expertise, trade supports and all kinds of stuff that sort of would tie Ukraine firmly into the EU and the West.
All right, I see. And in terms of a transition of government, probably after the peace deal, let's say, reached this year, then there would have to be new elections, right, also?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that, given the legislation in Ukraine about who could actually negotiate, and Zelensky's more recent statements that he would have to be the one to negotiate, which is to say that that they are unified, that it can't be broken in that way. But I also would read into those comments the idea that somebody like Zelensky is probably ready to conclude the peace talks and and make some hard decisions, which will not be politically very popular. And and ultimately, if the Russians there's a demand that, okay, he needs to step down, he's probably willing to kind of sacrifice himself in this process and say, okay, I'll step down and I'll take the blame for this deal and so forth. So then there can be a new government in Ukraine. So I wouldn't be too surprised if some of that is part of the logic on his part.
But currently, perhaps, I think he forbade himself from negotiating, and this is one of the remarks from the Russian side as well. They're not really willing to negotiate with him, right?
Yeah, that they don't want to do that. And I'm not entirely sure how firm that demand is, or what the real logic behind it is. And of course, Zelensky has a great deal of symbolic sort of significance for Ukrainians because of the war. But I don't see him as, at least in terms of what I've read in terms of about diplomacy, that he's particularly adept in terms of dealing with peace negotiations or something like that. So I don't think Russians view him as a negotiating threat necessarily, but because of the kind of symbolic role that he possesses in the Ukrainian society still, despite some of the dissent that they're trying to kind of eliminate him from that. But I think ultimately it would be in Russians' interest as well to have Zelensky there, because he does have credibility, and he could sort of help craft a deal that is not necessarily all that popular, but he could sort of go down in flames and take the blame for it. I mean, the analogy that comes to mind is from Finland in 1944. There was a trade deal that Finland had to make with Germany, although the military fortunes had clearly turned, but they needed some materials from Germany. So the Prime Minister Risto Ryti made a deal with Stalin that with Hitler that they will do this deal, and there's a kind of formal agreement. But on the Finnish side, they were clever. It was the Prime Minister that took it upon himself to sign it. So later it could be claimed that he did it without full authority, that he could take the blame for it. In fact, he did take the blame and suffer the consequences. But that was one way to sort of ensure that some sort of deal could be concluded.
But in terms of painful compromises, it seems like Zelensky has reiterated 100 times about NATO, at least aspiration, at least the promise that Ukraine might join in the future, even partially, right? But it seems that Russians, they will not accept it by any means, any type of NATO membership. It seems like Ukraine would have to make this painful compromise, perhaps pursue some type of neutrality, armed neutrality, yes, something like that, right?
Right. Yeah, and there's even been this term floated about, like Finland in the Cold War, Finlandization kind of idea that it's a neutrality. For Finns, it was an armed neutrality, but not a very strong one. And it was, Finland had to really be friendly with its neighbor, the Soviet Union. And of course, the Ukrainians have no interest in being friendly with Russia or playing by their rules or edicts or anything like that. So I think Ukrainians could accept some sort of armed sort of coexistence, call it neutrality or whatever. But as long as they get adequate military guarantees in terms of a true presence by EU and most likely some Americans as well, and NATO, that will give them enough credibility that they feel safe in it, and as well as technological assistance and all other kinds of things to bolster their own military. So Ukrainians will never accept any sort of, like Finland after the Second World War had to accept paring down its army military forces to a much lower level, that then it didn't quite have the military sort of capability or threat, and Ukrainians would never agree to anything like that.
Right, yeah. And also perhaps investing in defense production, perhaps joint ventures more actively, right? Do you
Yeah.
think that would be a great idea?
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea. I mean, it already would make a whole lot of sense that there's a lot of that going on presently as well in terms of certain types of military products, and Ukrainians have shown themselves to be particularly adept at producing drones, certain types of military missile technology, etc. So Ukraine already has some strengths in its military sector that would probably actually benefit Europe as a whole. So I could see these kinds of collaborative agreements and technological cooperation and licensing agreements. All those things are would be very probable in the near future.
Thanks, Jari. I don't have any other questions. If you don't have anything else to add, then I'll wrap it up.
All right, sounds good.
Thanks, Jari. Then
Thank you.
Thanks for today.